Hi, and welcome to this edition of the MGB Rebuild. This is a special edition on just the electrical work that I'm going to be doing. Car's been a bit of a disaster in the electrical sense, not a bit of a disaster in most senses, really, but anyway, it's a mess. So I've had a good look at all the various components, and I've decided that it needs a complete rewire. Some of the reasons behind this is that the loom as it stands, it's very dirty and the loom tape has come undone in many areas, but the loom itself had many additions or customizations. I'm sure the previous owner might refer to them as. There were lots of damaged connectors and broken connectors. The ignition switch itself had failed, so it had a nicely installed sawn-off screwdriver, and it had a few missing sub-looms, like the loom that went down to the gearbox and overdrive was missing completely. And the whole rat's nest of connections that lives, especially around the engine bay, looks really, I've never liked that. And I'm going to get rid of that by looming it a little more neatly. I've also decided that I'm going to do something about the looming here under the dashboard. So, since I'm replacing most of the gauges with digital gauges, they are all powered and they wire a little bit differently to these ones. So, I'm going to loom all the dashboard on a sub loom that sits on the back of the dash. And on the end of the dash, it'll have a single plug that you can undo that'll allow you to actually drop the dash down with all the wiring intact. I think that should make it a lot neater. As part of the rebuild of the looming, I'm going to look at some of the ways they did things in those days and probably bring it a little more up to date. I'm going to get rid of the high current cables that all run up in through the ignition key and switch that through an ignition relay rather than through the actual contacts on the key switch. I'm going to do a similar thing for the headlights so that we can pull that through a headlight relay and rather than feed all the current up through the light switch itself. I'm going to do the same for the horn. That worked the same way. That limited the current you can push into the horn. And then I'm also going to redesign the way that the fuse system works. There's four fuses, I think, and you pretty much blow a fuse and you lose almost everything in one go. So I'm going to split that up. I'm going to have a fuse for instrumentation power, a fuse for the wiper, the washers, and the heater fan, a separate fuse for the fuel pump, a fuse for the reversing lights, the overdrive, parking and panel lights will be on one, blinkers will be on another, and the horn will be on another. Finally the brake and the hazard lights, which I'm also going to wire in a hazard switch, will be on the final fuse. In fact, that's not the final fuse. There's one more, which will be footwell lights, boot lights, and engine bay lights if I bother to put them all in. Now, all this might sound a bit unnecessarily complicated, but in actual fact, having a few separate fuses like this does simplify the circuitry a little bit and neatens it because you don't have to have so many cables all coming into one great big spider of connection, and the fuse box can essentially have a bus up one side that in fact makes it easier to wire from. So finally, I'm going to mount all this stuff onto a panel, which will go on the inside of the firewall, right where the old one used to be, but a little bit lower, so it clears my bonnet struts. And that'll hold the fuses, the relays, and it'll also serve as a cover where I can bring the various looms from the front and from down on the gearbox and from out of the dash in behind that panel and hopefully hide a lot of that messy connector nonsense. So this image shows you the panel that I'm making. It's on the right there. You've got the multiple way fuse box, the three relays, one of which is a spare. The large relay on the left is the ignition relay, which is something of an overkill, but it switches everything in the car goes through that one relay. Down the bottom, you've got terminal blocks that do hot power and switched power. Just makes it easy if you want to add something new in the future, but also keeps that wiring nice and neat. Finally, if I'm going to do all this rewiring, it wouldn't be fair to then have a car that I might sell at some point in the future that has some bodgy wiring in it. So I needed to redo the diagram. and specifically make sure all the color coding was as close to original purpose as I could make it. Um, and add logic to the additional wires that I put in. So in the original MGB, I think they used brown for basically anything that was hot power, like straight to the battery terminal almost. They used green for um, the switched power downstream side, and white for the actual switched power upstream side of the fuse. The rest was a bit of a mix match, but there's a British standard for wiring color codes, so I've tried to use that wherever possible. At the end of the day, I'm trying to make a pretty comprehensive and neat wiring diagram. Hopefully it'll make me or help me wire it properly to start with, but secondly, it'll be there for the future. I've had one laminated and in a nice A2 size piece of paper, so old farts with bad eyes like me can read it pretty easily. So here's a bit of a progress picture. It's still a mess because I haven't started looming yet, but I'm laying up the wiring that needs to go in the dash. As you can see, these are digital gauges, and so um, the wiring on these is quite different to the wiring on the original ones. And we get rid of things like the thermostat spiral capillary tube and oil pressure tubes and things in favour of senders on the block. All that makes it a lot neater. Once I've finished getting all the wires in place, we can then go through and loom it, and that should actually result in a pretty neat install. I'll show you that later when it's finished. Finally, we'll be fitting a new uprated alternator, not because we really need it. Most of the lighting that I'm putting in is all LED based, so in fact there's a net decrease in current requirement, but we'll put in a new alternator because it needs one. Same with the starter motor. This starter motor is on its last legs. It doesn't measure very well on the field coils, so I'm going to replace that. So I've elected to get one of these new high torque, high efficiency starter motors that actually draws a lot less current than the old ones and spins the motor a bit faster as well. Um, so that's about all for this edition of the wiring. Once the body comes back from the paint shop, we can start putting the rest of the actual chassis wiring in, and that should be a bit of an adventure. So until next time, thank you.